its 3 years in Iraq, and more than $50 billion of it has gone to private contractors hired to guard bases, drive trucks, feed and shelter the troops, and rebuild the country. It's dangerous work, but much of the $50 billion, which is more than the annual budget of the Department of Homeland Security, has been handed out to companies in Iraq with little or no oversight. Billions of dollars are unaccounted for, and there are widespread allegations of waste, fraud, and war profiteering. As we first reported in February, only one case, the subject of a civil lawsuit, has been unsealed. It involves a company called Custer Battles and provides a window into the chaos of those early days in Iraq. When U.S. troops entered Baghdad in the spring of 2003, there was no electricity, widespread looting, and little evidence of post-war planning. With the American military stretched to the limit, the Pentagon set up the Coalition Provisional Authority to govern the country under Ambassador Paul Bremer, who began hiring private companies to secure and rebuild the country. There were no banks or wire transfers to pay them, no bean counters to keep track of the money, just vaults and footlockers stuffed with billions of dollars in cash.
Fresh, new, crisp, unspent, just printed $100 bills. It was the Wild West.
Frank Willis was the number 2 man at the Coalition Provisional Authority's Ministry of Transportation. The money was a mixture of Iraqi oil revenues, war booty, and U.S. government funds earmarked for the Coalition Authority. Whenever cash was needed, someone went down to the vault with a wheelbarrow or gunny sacks.
Those are $100,000 bricks of $100 bills, and that's $2 million there. This, in fact, is a payment that we made on the 1st of August to a company called Custer Battles.
These are called bricks, right?
Sometimes we referred to them as footballs because we passed them around in little pickup games in our office.
Do you have any evidence that the accounting system was a little loose?
I would describe it as non-existent.
The $2 million given to Custer Battles was the first installment on a contract to provide security at Baghdad International Airport. The company had been started by Scott Custer, a former Army Ranger, and Mike Battles, an unsuccessful congressional candidate from Rhode Island who claimed to be active in the Republican Party and have connections at the White House. They arrived in Baghdad with no money, yet within a year they landed $100 million in contracts.
They came in with a can-do attitude, whether they could or not. They always said yes.
They have any experience?
They were not experienced. They did not know what they were doing.
Complaints about Custer Battles' performance at the airport began almost immediately. Colonel Richard Ballard, the top inspector general for the Army in Iraq, was assigned to see if the company was living up to its contract, such as it was.
The contract looked to me like something that you and I would write over a bottle of vodka, complete with all the spelling and syntax errors and annexes to be filled in later. Presented it the next day, and then got awarded about a $15 million contract.
Custer Battles was supposed to provide security for commercial aviation at Baghdad Airport, including personnel, machinery, and canine teams to screen passengers and cargo. But the airport never reopened for commercial traffic. Instead of canceling the contract or requiring Custer Battles to return the money, the Coalition Authority instead assigned them to operate a checkpoint outside the airport. How'd they do on that job?
They failed miserably.
Was anybody paying attention to this money and where it was going?
There was significant concern, but there just were not the people in theater to monitor that kind of thing on a day-to-day basis.
So the answer is?
No.
What do you mean? As for the bomb-sniffing canine teams,
I eventually saw one dog. The dog did not appear to be a certified trained dog, and the dog was incapable of operating in that environment.
What do you mean incapable of operating in that environment?
He would be brought to the checkpoint, and he would lie down, and he would refuse to sniff the vehicles.
What about the handler? Do you have a handler?
The handler had no certificate and no evidence.
So neither the dog nor the handler were qualified?
I think it was a guy with his pet, to be honest with you.
In a memo obtained by 60 Minutes, the airport's director of security wrote to the Coalition Authority, Custer Battles has shown themselves to be unresponsive, uncooperative, incompetent, deceitful, manipulative, and war profiteers. Other than that, they're swell fellows.
I would agree with most of that.
Even the war profiteers?
I think that what they were doing was of the nature of what I understand war profiteering to be about, which is to get into a chaotic situation and milk every penny out of it you can as fast as you can before the opportunity goes away.
The Coalition Authority not only refused to throw Custer Battles off the airport job, it wrote them a glowing review and continued to give them contracts, including one to supply logistical support for a massive program to replace the Iraqi currency.
And how did Custer Battles perform that contract?
Absolutely abysmally. I mean, it was beyond a joke.
Philip Wilkinson was a colonel in the British Army assigned to the Coalition Authority's Ministry of Finance and charged with providing security to convoys that traveled all over Iraq loaded with $3 billion in cash. The trucks were supplied by Custer Battles.
And you can imagine open trucks with that sort of money on the back was just a red-hot target for not only terrorists but criminals, and therefore we needed trucks that were going to work. When those trucks were delivered to us, some of them were physically dragged into our compound.
They were towed into the camp?
Towed into the camp.
And Custer Battles' response?
When questioned as to the serviceability of the trucks was, we were only told we had to deliver the trucks. The contract doesn't say they had to work. Which, I mean, when you're given that sort of answer, what can you do?
How did they get away with it?
I really don't know. I mean, it was just a joke. The assumption that we had was that they had to have high political top cover to be able to get away with it, because it was just outrageous, their failure to deliver that which they were contracted to do.
In fact, the company continued to work in Iraq for another year, even after Robert Isaacson, one of Custer Battles' major subcontractors, went to federal authorities with allegations of criminal misconduct. Isaacson and another whistleblower claim Custer Battles bilked the government out of $50 million, and they're suing the company on behalf of U.S. taxpayers to recover some of the money.
Well, they approached me 3 times to participate in a defrauding of the United States government. They wanted to open fraudulent companies overseas and inflate their invoices to the United States government.
Did the fraud actually take place?
2 weeks later, apparently, from what I'm understanding. 2 weeks later, they began exactly the fraud they described to me.
According to a subsequent investigation by the U.S. Air Force, Custer Battles set up sham companies in the Cayman Islands to fabricate phony invoices that it submitted to the Coalition Authority with the intention of fraudulently inflating its profits. According to this Custer Battles spreadsheet, which was left behind after a meeting with U.S. officials, the company submitted invoices on the currency contract totaling nearly $10 million, when its actual costs were less than $4 million. Electricity costs of $74,000 were invoiced to the Coalition Authority at $400,000. Those trucks that didn't work were bought on the local market for $228,000 and billed at $800,000.
Upwards of $70 million.
Mike Battles and Scott Custer, who were currently under investigation by the Justice Department, declined to be interviewed for this story because of the whistleblower lawsuit. But in a videotaped deposition for that case, Scott Custer disavowed any knowledge of the phony invoices.
Would you agree with me that it is highly improper for a contractor to simply fabricate invoices and then hand them in for payment?
Yes. I mean, the short answer, I don't believe, I'm not a government contracts expert or a legal expert, but I would think it's improper to fabricate anything that you know to not be true.
Custer and Mike Battles blamed their problems on former employees, competitors, and the bureaucratic incompetence of the CPA.
I know we were supposed to do one thing for a certain amount of money, and by the time it was said and done, they asked us to do many, many more things for a greater amount of money.
I think what's happening over there is an orgy of greed here with contractors.
Today, the Policy Committee is holding a 5th hearing.
North Dakota Senator Byron Dorgan, chairman of the Democratic Party Policy Committee, says Custer Battles is small potatoes compared to behemoths like Halliburton and its subsidiary, Kellogg Brown & Root, who have collected half of all the money awarded to contractors in Iraq, and according to Defense Department auditors, have overbilled taxpayers by more than $1 billion.
That's the one.
Dorgan's committee has held hearings and heard testimony that Halliburton has overcharged for meals and fuel and gouged taxpayers on items as trivial as these hand towels.
Instead of buying a white towel, which would be $1.60, his company said, no, put embroidery our logo on it, $5. So What's the difference? Well, the American taxpayer is going to pay the bill.
Halliburton says the towels were embroidered to keep them from being stolen or lost, and that allegations that overbilled by $1 billion are exaggerated. But Dorgan says none of this is being seriously investigated.
Let me tell you that there's very little oversight by anybody on anything in this Congress. We have a president and a Congress of the same party. They have no interest in doing any aggressive oversight.
The only one really looking into it is Stuart Bowen, the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction, a position created by Congress back in 2004 to monitor construction and development projects to rebuild Iraq.
How would you describe the oversight early on with the CPA?
It was relatively non-existent.
In 2 lengthy reports, Bowen's staff outlined suspected fraud and incompetence of staggering proportions, like the $8.8 billion that the coalition seems to have lost track of.
$8.8 billion.
That's right.
And that's money that is not accounted for.
Not accounted for.
What you seem to be saying is that nobody really knows exactly where that $8.8 billion went to.
That's right.
Some of the money, Bowen says, was spent on projects it was intended for. It's just that there are no receipts. But some of it, like the funds to buy books and train personnel at this library in Karbala, simply vanished. 4 people have already been arrested on bribery and theft charges, and more arrests will follow.
How many investigations do you have going on right now?
Nearly 50.
And these are all involving suspected fraud or suspected
Fraud, kickbacks, bribery, waste.
involving American companies.
That's right.
Shortly after our